So before I begin, I'd like to just start with saying that I am grateful to live and work on the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850, and the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy, and recognize the contributions made by the Métis people to our communities. I seek to learn and grow from the many nations who live and have history on the land and waterways that characterize this region. So as Zinda mentioned, I'm going to be discussing a bit today about wearable devices and how we can bring them from the lab and into the field, and how these can be useful tools to facilitate us in making our decisions for occupational work. And so hopefully you can see here as the slides or the images at the bottom, sort of demonstrating how we're starting to investigate how the body responds to thermal strain, various devices that we can use to assess and provide direction in terms of work. And I always like to present an image, or rather an updated image from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, highlighting just how bad our global temperatures have started to rise and shift over the last century and a bit. And what we can see here in this first figure above is just a snapshot of November 2021 in comparison to a 30-year period from 1980 to 2010. We can clearly recognize, if we look specifically at our North America, we have started to drastically exceed what used to be somewhat normal. And if we highlight how our average temperature has increased over year by year from the 20th century average, we're starting to see these creeps consistently above 1 degree Celsius since 2010. And so we can clearly identify that excessive thermal strain and climate change will impact us as a human, but also in our occupational sectors. And more recently, a body of work conducted by Dr. Josh Foster during part of his dissertation under the direction of Dr. Ravanelli at Loughborough University started to identify what physical work capacities and what the changes might be over various indices of thermal strain. And so part of his work was looking at over 300 one-hour assessments of individuals walking at a fixed heart rate on a treadmill under a variety of climatic conditions. And I'm only giving you one snapshot of his data set. He's also got the effects of air velocity and solar load as well. But we can clearly see that the amount of physical work done over those hours is drastically reduced as our climate becomes hotter and hotter, and reducing up to less than 20% of what we could previously do in a cooler condition. The reasons for this reduction in physical work, particularly as we do a fixed heart rate intensity protocol, is due to our interactions and our ways in which we try to mitigate our thermal strain during these periods. And I would go into far more detail into this depiction in an hour-long seminar, but the crux of it is we are able to dissipate the heat that we're generating and absorbing from the body through various ways. And the ways in which we do this is through perspiration off the skin. So we can think of this as sweating. We also increase our heart rate and we vasodilate our skin surface so that we're able to adequately distribute heat from our core to our skin and lose it to the body, or lose it to the environment. However, under excessive thermal strain, these systems become compromised because we have less and less of a gradient to work with. And so we start relying on others, predominantly sweating, to dissipate that heat to the environment that we're engaging in. And obviously other things can affect us, such as the clothing that we're wearing. Say you have a sock layer as well. Our size can also impact our conduction of heat off of the body and into the environment. And so these are just a brief snapshot of how our body regulates itself under these conditions. Now, if we leave these systems unchecked, we can start producing some physiological strain. And when we have these rises in core temperature, these have a direct stimulant for increasing heart rate itself, but also as increases in work and thermoregulatory drive to vasodilate our skin will have increases in heart rate. And these increases in heart rate could precipitate over time to decreases in blood pressure due to the large systemic vasodilatory response that we have. This is compounded by effects from dehydration that occur from prolonged work. This is to support our continual sweating from the skin surface to evaporate the heat. This could then lead to us having systemic fluid loss, and ultimately resulting in chronic dehydration if we don't replenish the fluid that we have. So at this point here, I'm going to start bringing in a bit of the wearables that we can exploit to monitor ourselves as we're exposed to these environmental conditions. Principally, if we're concerned as primarily the internal changes in internal temperature or the absolute internal temperature that we're observing and modifications in skin temperature, we can start utilizing items such as gastrointestinal pills to monitor temperature. These are a quite expensive approach. However, they do have considerable reliability in occupational context. We also have a cheaper option, which is flexible thermometers that can be in various orifices and monitored continuously. Again, it depends on how you want to interface them. More recent wearables have started to look at mouth guards themselves and measuring the temperature within the mouth during exercise to try and get an index of how hot someone might be. And another item that recently came out of the market are something called heat flux sensors, and they start to try to estimate the amount of heat that the body's actually radiating off itself into the environment. We want to look at the surface. There are many things like eye buttons and surface thermometers that are readily available. Another item that we can look at is heart rate, and we can monitor this in real time using typical heart rate monitor straps, such as the Polar straps or Garmin straps. Newer approaches have looked at photoplethysmography. And the best approach that I can say is if you have an active watch that has some kind of heart rate built in, typically it's using some form of PPG. The other applications that you can use on your cell phone that exploit the camera and your flash use a PPG monitor as well. Holter devices, if you're in a more clinical setting, but they can also be used in occupational contexts too, and they're measuring ECG continuously during over a period of what's being monitored. We want to monitor blood pressure. There's ambulatory blood pressures that can go off throughout the day. You can take stationary cuff measures as well, using a basic automated cuff or traditional manual procedures. And then more recently, there's been this exposure of blood pressure trend devices. These don't measure blood pressure exclusively, but they do some very fancy algorithms of the PPG signals that you would receive from heart rate to give you an indication of how blood pressure is transiently changing over time. If you're interested in looking at sweating, there's other multiple ways like microchannel patches. These have been recently manufactured as commercial devices within Gatorade specifically, where microtubules in a patch start to fill up with water, and the rate at which they fill up with water is indicative of sweating. There's technical absorbents. These are patches that we place on the skin that collect water over time. And then more recent work that my lab has been involved in is these mechanical ventilated capsules that actually measure sweating in real time locally. The only downside to them is battery life. Fluid losses, simple as body mass measures intermittently and measuring fluid intake and consumption. And lastly, if you want to assess dehydration, you can use items such as refractometers to assess the urine-specific gravity in people's urine. And you could even go a little bit further and use urinalysis strips that have multiple different reactive agents on them. And you could assess a multitude of items. And there are some algorithms that have been developed that use machine learning to interpret these analysis strips without using human interaction. This area, we still, in my opinion, have yet to fully elucidate how we could describe this, but if you have reached these periods where we start having splenic ischemia, endotoxemia, and heat-related cell death, you're under serious health and heat-related illness, and these symptoms should have precipitated in advance of that. The purpose of this slide is really to show how involved and how expansive the wearable industry and the way in which we can measure these items within someone is really a lot of information that we can obtain. And then some systems have actually started integrating them and trying to combine them. We have the EquiVitals pictured here and a Hexoskin, which combine some of the measurements in one period. And recently I've come across this paper that came out in Sensors a couple of weeks ago that actually developed their own smaller sensor with a host of items that they're measuring. You've got activity as well in here through 3-axis accelerometry, PPGs, and their own proprietary or somewhat proprietary algorithm of all these sensors. So to give you an idea of how these wearable sensors would work, they all connect into this platform, and then there's some kind of cloud server and hosting machine learning algorithm that's interpreting this data. And then we have a bunch of this data coming through in real time, presumably, for an individual. And so we come into these scenarios where, do we just have too much data and we are trying to monitor people in real time, and we don't actually know how to fully interpret this data in that concurrent reality of whether we should stop someone from working or eliminate their work or stop them to doing certain things. We have an idea of what would be happening in real time in certain parameters, but we don't actually know when should we stop this work. And so the idea and probably the approach that we've taken at this point is starting to predict the risk of heat-related illness, utilizing those graphs and depictions of different thermal indices as outlined by Dr. Foster in his dissertation. And some of the work that I had previously undertaken was developing what we would call an API platform that starts to integrate a bunch of these features and information that we would need to start giving us predictive outputs. And so we have information such as physical characteristics, exercise, environment, location, clothing, that all impact the way in which we interact with our environment. This is put into a platform that myself and Boris Kingma at the Dutch Institute of Technology developed, the Human Heat Exchange API, that when you give it sufficient parameters, it'll actually give you a host of outputs and validated thermal indices to assess whether this climatic condition is appropriate for work or not. And this has actually been integrated into what's called the ClimApp, which is one of the largest heat shield EU-funded projects known as the Heat Shield Project. So I encourage you guys, if you're interested in looking into this API and how it could be used, the link is right left down here in the corner. And we're also in process, my lab's in process of developing a unique, or rather a bespoke environmental sensing unit that will be able to ping directly to the Heat Exchange API and provide you real-time feedback of the conditions and how you'd be able to, or whether you should continue work under these environments without appreciable reductions in performance. So I've talked about how we can monitor in real time, how we can identify concerning environments for people to work in. But another issue that we have right now is, how do we prepare people for work under these conditions? And how can we predict whether someone's going to be at increased risk of thermal strain? One of the items, one of the graphs here and the information that we have is from the early mining work by Driosti in South African mines. And what we recognize here, if you look at the bar graph with the white bars here, these are or natives with no previous mining experience. And we recognize that if they have no experience of being in the heat, they suffer a greater risk of exertional heat illness and a higher core temperature during their physical work. A recent report from the Center of Disease Control and Prevention on Morbidity and Mortality Weekly highlights the factors related to these occupational heat stress outcomes. And what the largest incidence of fatalities was due to the fact that these people were unacclimatized to the heat. And about 78% of those mortalities of the 14 that were reported here, so 11 of 14, they were documented as not being acclimatized to entering into that heat. To really drive this further, we know from military studies where there's rapid deployment that if people are not having the time or not heat acclimated prior to embarkment or engagement in their period, we know that there's this increased risk of heat illness attendance, this red line here, in those first few days of deployment. So in those first 2 weeks of deployment, we see this larger risk of exertional heat illness among these people. And so we need to find a way to prepare them for exercise in the heat. And one of the tip of our occupational work in the heat, and one of the best ways we do this is through heat acclimation. And so I'll give you a gross overview of heat acclimation, but typically it's a period of 7 to 14 days of frequent and repetitive work under heat stress. And we see these physiological changes that occur with them to support a reduction in thermal strain during their exposure. And so one of the things that we might not have in an occupational setting is 7 to 14 days to actually heat acclimate someone And so myself and Boris Kingma and Matthew Kramer at the Department of Research and Defense Canada, who works in the military sector for as a research scientist in thermal physiology, we're trying to identify the markers that would be easiest to monitor within an occupational setting or in an at-home setting as well, that wouldn't require too much overhead. Core temperature was taken off the list quite quickly because it's very cumbersome to measure core temperature and it's quite costly. Skin temperature as well, because this can be directly influenced by your environment. Thermal comfort is a perceptual response, and while you might have a reduced thermal comfort or improved thermal comfort, it doesn't actually tell you how you're responding physiologically. Exercise capacity was a good one. However, we know that with people after heat acclimation, they have a higher tolerance to higher core temperatures, and so this might not always work. And plasma volume as well was taken off the list because it was something that you would require blood draws to measure effectively. And so we were left with heart rate and sweat rate. These are two simple things that we can measure in person prior to deployment. So heart rate being with a simple heart rate strap and sweating being changes in body mass. And what we know when you look at people as their partial and complete heat acclimation, so partial being post-training, pre-training being no acclimation, and post-heat acclimation being complete heat acclimation, we know that the drift in heart rate over time is considerably less. And what we wanted to do was integrate sweating into this parameter as well. And what we did was we expressed this as a function of the cardiovascular drift to whole body sweat rate over the period of 60 minutes of exercise. And these are under thermally straining conditions to really target these environments. And so what we see here is that we're able to detect people's heat acclimation status a little bit earlier and have more categorical indices between those three groups. And we denoted this as what we call a drift adjusted sweat index. And we then applied this to a thermal model, particularly because past year or two of COVID, we've been unable to do some in-person work to fully address this. But if you use a thermal model and you, which is a highly involved model of various parameters, we're able to detect these changes under various conditions, not necessarily in cooler conditions, but at least in some temperate climates, we're able to detect this, which offers the opportunity to assess someone prior to deployment under simple and accessible conditions to define their heat acclimation status. We don't necessarily need that thermal chamber to fully elucidate whether someone is partially or fully heat acclimated relative to another individual. But I must interject here to confirm and say that this is more of a ranking system and it's not an identification of someone's heat acclimation status. And the idea of promoting DAS and utilizing DAS in an occupational context is to stratify a cohort of individuals and say who's at most risk and who's at least risk of heat tolerance, so that we can provide monitorization of the people who are at greater risk of heat tolerance and the people who may be at low risk during these occupational work periods. I'm looking at my time and I'm seeing that I might be going to the end, but this is my last slide here on final thoughts as I've put this presentation together. And there's a lot of wearables available. You need to think about what's the most appropriate and how we utilize them, how they might interfere with the task and the demand that we're doing. Also the reliability and validity. These are things that we don't need or we don't know. There's also the idea of where this information is going and interpreting that data. I think there's still a lot more work that needs to be done in how we're going to interpret this data and what's the most pertinent to what we are trying to monitor. And I think right now the best solutions are probably the proactive approaches of characterizing the environments that people are going to be working, the tasks that they're going to be doing, and assessing what the limits to those tasks under those scenarios are. And then probably providing some context of how we identify people who may be at high risk and low risk using very simple and non-invasive biomarkers. And so with that, I'll leave you with my final slide saying thank you to my collaborators, both near and far, and the student trainees that currently work in my lab.